Welcome to episode 270 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Oliver Buck Revell, who served in the FBI for 30 years. In this episode, he reviews the FBI Dallas Division's investigation into allegations of dirty tricks made during the 1992 presidential campaign primary involving the campaigns of President George H.W. Bush and candidate Ross Perot. He also discusses the important but precarious role of the FBI in politics while investigating criminal matters with serious political implications. During his bureau career, Buck Revell assumed many leadership roles, culminating with his promotion to Associate Deputy Director in charge of investigations and Special Agent in charge of the Dallas Field Office. Buck Revell is the author of A G-Man's Journal, a legendary career inside the FBI from the Kennedy assassination to the Oklahoma City bombing, in which he shares highlights from his career. Now, if this case review sounds familiar, it's because this is an encore episode previously posted on June 15th, 2019, as episode 170. The audio and show notes have been edited and updated. When I called Buck to let him know that I was reposting this episode, I asked if he wanted to provide an updated statement. Here's what he told me. He said he had worked every kind of political corruption case there is, from local police, county commissioners and state representatives, to federal judges, congressmen, and senators. However, working a case involving a president or a presidential candidate is obviously the most difficult and sensitive. He says that you just have to follow the law and your oath and not let anyone lead you astray. In the end, that is what the vast majority of the American people want and expect of the FBI. Thanks for those words of wisdom, Buck. Now, this is my statement. After hearing the ugly threats directed at FBI employees, I'm doubling down on using FBI Retired Case File Review to showcase the tried and true processes that the FBI follows to investigate cases. The evidence required to obtain search and arrest warrants, the role of the United States Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice in pursuing indictments and charges, and the rules of federal court proceedings. Some may label my silence about alleged partisan actions of the FBI and individual agents as blind allegiance, but nothing could be further from the truth. I often remind you that the Bureau is not perfect, and I have several episodes about the FBI's past screw-ups. I'm going to continue to do what Director Wray is telling current employees to do. I'm going to keep my head down, do the work, and let my podcast, books, and blog speak for me. If you're listening to this episode in September 2022, listen up. I have two important messages for you. First, my usual message. Look out for my September Reader Team email. It should be in your inbox. If not, please check your spam filter and promotions tab. I also want you to know that I am taking the rest of the month off. I'll be back with a brand new episode on October 5th. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there are links to where you can check out the show notes, join my reader team, buy me a coffee, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support of my mission and of the FBI. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Oliver Buck Revell. Hi, Buck. How are you?
I'm doing great, Jerry. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. This is actually the second time that you're back on FBI Retired Case File Review. we had you on in episode 110. You told us the origin story of the extraterritorial jurisdiction and how that came about. And it was fascinating. And it still gets lots of downloads every day. So thank you for doing that. It really makes me excited about talking to you about this case review. When you reminded me that it was in your book and I went back and read it, I was like, ooh, deja vu. And that's one thing I've learned from doing these case reviews is that definitely, I know for sure that history does repeat itself. And right now, the FBI is involved in a political, I guess you'd call it a nightmare, that started with allegations that occurred during the last presidential campaign. And you know all about this. So give us a start on what this story is about and how you became involved in it.
Well, Jerry, at the time of this story, I was the agent in charge in Dallas. Prior to that, I had spent 11 years in headquarters as an assistant director and then as the associate deputy director. And during that time, I had become involved in three significant cases that involve the political process at the most senior level. Of course, Watergate is the most famous. Then the Abscam case, where we were investigating members of Congress and senators and interacted with all three branches of the government. And then the last one, when I was in Washington before I came to Dallas, was the Iran-Contra affair. So as SAC in Dallas, I didn't expect to be involved in that type of investigative activity. And then in 1992, August of 1992, I received a telephone call from Bill Rathburn, the chief of the Dallas Police Department. He said he had a very confidential matter that he wanted to talk with me about, and he sent his deputy chief, Rudy Diaz, to the office to talk with me. Rudy related that an individual by the name of Scott Barnes had come to Ross Perot claiming to have been approached by the Bush campaign, wanting him to bug Perot's phones and office and to collect intelligence on Perot's campaign. Barnes had been accompanied, the man was Scott Barnes was his name, had been accompanied by a British broadcast reporter, BBC reporter by the name of David Taylor. The context was that in the months leading up to this situation, Bush and Perot had been going at each other very strongly. Of course, Bush was the sitting president, and Perot had come out to actually run against him as an independent candidate. And it had become quite bitter, even though both knew each other quite well from their Texas origins and other political activities. Perot had just recently announced at that time that he was going to withdraw, and yet there was still campaign activities involving him that kept it in the news. Barnes, again, the individual who brought the allegation to the Perot office, claimed that he had information that there had been an attempt, and it was ongoing, by the Bush campaign to bug, wiretap, and spy upon Perot and his activities. The story was rather strained at the time because Perot had withdrawn. But, of course, we were not interviewing Barnes or Taylor, the BBC reporter. They didn't know that we were even involved. So we had to see where that took us. Well, as we went forward, we found out that they had been able to furnish, again, to a former agent named Jim Ciano, who was actually working for Perot on running down these allegations. And Jim had, after the police had entered the case, had come to us and told us what Perot was doing, but he hadn't told Perot that the FBI was involved. So Ciano indicated that Barnes had information in his hand, including confidential telephone numbers, diagrams of Perot's office, some equipment that could be used for bugging or wiretapping, and other materials, and indicated that he had actually had meetings with an individual in the Bush campaign. And they indicated this individual was a person named Jim Oberwetter. Well, I knew of Jim Oberwetter. He was fairly prominent in Dallas business activities, was also known to be a very close friend of George Jr., actually George W. Bush, who at the time was a Dallas businessman, and of course the son of President Bush, and that he was a close friend of the family. So this lent additional concern, because if in fact we were talking, the undercover agent would be in contact with a member of the presidential campaign, we were treading on very thin ice. So we had to have a very strong predicate to make any contact with Jim Oberwetter or the person that Barnes presented as the representative of the Bush campaign that he had talked with.
In normal circumstances, when you have an allegation, the obligation of the FBI is to look into it, to pursue it.
Right.
Could you talk to us about some of the hesitations? Is there actual written different rules or regulations when it comes to a high-level investigation like this? You talked about predication. Is this handled differently than any other allegation that you would receive about somebody potentially committing a crime?
Well, I fall back to the days when I had the oversight responsibility in headquarters, and we required, and I can't cite the manual citation, but it was there, that any investigation of a prominent political figure, whatever the party, must be first acknowledged by conferring with headquarters, and then headquarters would, if the allegation seemed sufficient to investigate, clear it with the Justice Department. So the Bureau would not go forward with an investigation until it was cleared by both FBI headquarters and DOJ, at least the Assistant Attorney General, and generally at the Deputy Attorney General level, that this was appropriate to go forward and investigate. So that's where we were in this process.
That seems so, I guess the word is still subjective, because a lot of times when you have an allegation, you may not have anything, concrete. That's what the investigation is supposed to bring forward. But I can see how dangerous it is to begin an investigation on an allegation, especially in this situation where, if leaked, could do damage to all the parties involved. So I can't wait to hear how it was determined for you to take those next steps.
You're exactly correct. And I, of course, knew these precarious circumstances and why no matter what we did, there was going to be fraught with peril for the reputation of the Bureau, and equally important, the possibility of accusations being put out in public that would damage the reputation of people who had done nothing wrong. So when we received word back, Doug Gow was my replacement at headquarters as Associate Deputy Director. And so when I got word back from Doug that he discussed it with Bill Sessions, and they had discussed it with the Justice Department. An individual by the name of George Twilliger was the Deputy Attorney General, and he had been briefed and understood that we were feeling out the case at this point to see if there was a case, and we're going to do nothing that would implicate either party in any illegal activities until we had a basis to believe a crime had actually been committed. At this point, we didn't even know if a crime had been committed. So we proceeded on the basis of we were going to determine if we had a criminal predicate to go into a full-blown investigation.
You had mentioned the name Bill Sessions, so I take it at the time William Sessions was the director of the FBI?
That's correct. And I, of course, had worked with Judge Sessions for 5 years before I came to Dallas and knew him quite well. So I had no difficulty in making sure that he was in the loop. Doug Gow I'd worked with had actually reported to me before I came to Dallas, so I knew Doug quite well. So we were very tightly linked in, and we all realized that we were treading on very thin ice and did not want to jeopardize the activities of either campaign. At the same time, we did not want the Bureau subjected to allegations that, one, it wouldn't proceed to investigate people in high places, or two, that we undertook an investigation for political purposes, both of which were obviously not true.
It doesn't sound like either way what's the best word to use? You know what word I want to use.
Right, yeah. we were in peril either way.
Yes, there you go.
By the way, Bob Mueller was the Assistant Attorney General Criminal Division, and he and Twilliger were the two people in the department that were briefed and acknowledged and agreed with the investigative strategy that we undertook. So Bob got an early dose of the sensitivities of these kind of cases.
Wow. And so, let me just stop you just for a second and ask you. You had talked about being involved, or being aware of how difficult these cases are from Watergate and Iran-Contra, and what was the other one?
Abscam.
And Abscam. Is there any way that the FBI could be involved in cases like this without being accused of being political or partisan?
Probably not. And so you just have to let the record stand for itself and be prepared at the end of the process to justify what you did on the basis of the law, the evidence, and proper procedure. But if you think you're going to come through this type of investigation unscathed, then that's not being really very realistic to the circumstances we face in the country at this time. After we reached this point, I assigned have brought my public corruption squad into the loop. We assigned an undercover agent who fit the role as the person who would actually be installing the equipment in Perot's office on behalf of Oberwetter or whoever it was that was alleged to be this contact on the Bush campaign. But we also put in the scenario, and again, the only one that knew who we were was Jim Ciano. Perot didn't know we were there, and obviously the Bush campaign did not know. So the next step was to have Barnes, the person who made the allegations, go back to the person he claimed to be in contact with in the Bush campaign and to get that person's agreement and acquiescence for our undercover agent to actually go ahead and place a wiretap and a bug and do other clandestine activities. Now, we had no intention of doing any of that, but we were going to convey that to whoever this person was that Barnes was indicating was facilitating and directing the penetration and surreptitious collection of information from the Perot camp. Well, the undercover agent went to a meeting where, in fact, Barnes did meet in the lobby of a downtown business in Dallas with an individual that we identified by surveillance as Jim Oberwetter. And Oberwetter came down into the lobby, met with Barnes. During that process, looked over at us and acknowledged the undercover agent, but did not meet with him. He didn't take the meeting at that point. So we were in a position, again, still being uninformed as to whether Oberwetter was actually involved in a criminal conspiracy or if, in fact, this individual was trying to set up the Bush campaign or the Perot campaign. We weren't sure which way it was going, but Barnes definitely had a agenda in this process. And of course, the BBC reporter, Taylor, was there observing and filming, and we knew what they were looking for. They were looking to run a story that would blast everybody involved. And so we had to be very careful that they didn't get out front of where we were, even though we had no contact or control over what they were doing, and they did not know we were involved. So when it came back, and we had to observe that, in fact, the person that the undercover agent saw meeting with Barnes was Jim Oberwetter. And we verified that Jim Oberwetter was President Bush's campaign manager in Texas. Then we came back and I initiated contacts with Washington to get approval for our undercover agent to go in and meet with Jim Oberwetter and to tell Oberwetter that he was ready to go ahead and carry out this illicit collection of intelligence on Perot and his offices. This cleared all the way from Sessions to Twilliger and Mueller and at the department. And so we set it up to go back and meet with Jim Oberwetter. Unfortunately, here we ran into a real glitch. For reasons unknown to us, Barnes said he met with the undercover agent, said he was just calling it off and he was leaving. And the undercover agent said, well, why? What's going on? He said, I'm just through with it. And he took off. Taylor was still available to us, but we had to go and attempt to get information from him on why Barnes was pulling back. He didn't, again, know who we were talking to. He thought he was still talking to an employee of Perot. Taylor said he didn't know why Barnes had reneged, and he still believed that Barnes had a accurate allegation, but he just was not in a position to say why he had left. I decided and got concurrence from headquarters that I was going to send the undercover agent to meet with Oberwetter on a blind meeting where Oberwetter would not know he was an FBI agent and would still think he was associated with this attempt to collect intelligence against Perot.
I think that we should remind everyone listening that even if Barnes left and it was, in his words, over, that the attempt is still a crime.
Yes, and we had information that indicated they had already collected intelligence. We had the materials that they had furnished as proof of the involvement on collecting intelligence on Perot, and we had the meeting with Oberwetter, which we were not involved directly in, but we observed meeting with Barnes and Oberwetter and the Hunt Oil Company lobby where Oberwetter worked. So we had that kind of verification that there was an issue here that we needed to resolve. So in going back to meet with Oberwetter, the undercover agent was representing himself as the person that Barnes had told Oberwetter was going to carry out these activities. When our undercover agent met with Oberwetter, and he did meet with him, he showed Oberwetter what he was doing, how he's going to do it, and what he expected to obtain. And Oberwetter immediately disclaimed this and said, well, why would you do that? And made a number of comments about he didn't know what the undercover agent was talking about. The agent tried to make sure that Oberwetter knew that this was a connection to the individual that he had been seen talking with, in other words, Barnes. And Oberwetter said, I don't really know that guy. He just called me and I had nothing to do with what you're talking about, and I'm going to contact the police. Well, that was fine. That was exactly what we wanted to know. So our undercover agent came back. We, of course, had observations ongoing by our surveillance team, and we were able to document all this. So when the undercover agent came back, debriefed us, I was able to essentially go back to headquarters and tell them that there was no ongoing activity by the Bush campaign to take any action against Perot. And it looked like this was entirely a fabrication on the part of Barnes and perhaps Taylor.
Wow.
Right. And so I told them that the headquarters that I was going to send agents out overtly and interview Oberwetter, Barnes, and Taylor and let them know the FBI was there and try and determine exactly what was going on. Well, in going and interview Oberwetter, he was apparently shocked and greatly upset that the FBI had sent an undercover agent to meet with him and kept saying, well, I could have been entrapped. And of course, he could not have can't entrap somebody unless they willingly commit a crime or agree to commit a crime. But we understood the great concern that he had. As far as Barnes, had to track him out to Arizona. He claimed to have had information that he was just trying to pass on and that he hadn't concocted or made up anything. And then he said, can I get immunity? And of course, that's a trigger. And the agents told him no. And he immediately stopped talking to him. As far as Taylor was concerned, he claimed the only thing he was doing was just following Barnes and seeing where it took him. And that he didn't know whether it was the allegations were true or not. And that was very apparently false. So at this point, we had essentially reached a culmination. We had stopped any investigation as to whether or not there had actually been an attempt by the Bush campaign to spy on the Perot campaign. But we had now the allegations, or not the allegations, but the indications of criminality on the part of Barnes and possibly the BBC reporter Taylor. So I again informed headquarters that we were going to undertake that process, and that was all agreed to. Well, everything settled down until about, 2 days later, there was a story that broke in the Houston Chronicle about the person by the name of our undercover agent who had been in contact with the Bush campaign about activities in the Perot office. Well, we knew at this point that either Barnes or Taylor or both had leaked because they were the only ones that actually even knew the undercover agent's name and didn't realize he was an undercover agent, but did know the name and knew that there had been contact.
So when they were both approached, they were never told that that person meeting with Oberwetter was an FBI undercover agent.
No, in fact, neither Barnes nor Taylor knew that we had sent the undercover agent in. They had pulled back after Barnes had indicated he wasn't going to go forward, and we had to make a decision to send the undercover agent in absent Barnes' direct involvement, because otherwise we couldn't tell whether what he was alleging to us in his contact with Oberwetter was in fact true, factual, or if it was a fabrication.
Wow. So I'm still trying to figure out in my mind who else other than those two, since they weren't directly aware of it, could have leaked that information. It sounds like it was definitely somebody who had a smear campaign to.
Well, the only person that made sense that would know the names and who had met was Taylor, the BBC reporter. And of course, he could have told Barnes about it, but we suspected that the BBC reporter had contacted somebody in the Houston Chronicle and leaked that part of the story, which was essentially all that he knew at the time, and did not know about the fact that Barnes had withdrawn and that Overwetter disclaimed any knowledge when he had been contacted by the undercover agent.
So here you have a situation where you were trying to be extremely sensitive and get the answers to these questions without it being leaked to the public. And even though you're winding down on, the primary allegations, now it's out in the public.
It is at least a part of the story, which was only a very superficial part. But in fact, the Chronicle had indications or had a story that they put out that there had been an attempt on the part of the Bush campaign to put a surreptitious collection of information inside of the Perot campaign. So that was out there in the Houston Chronicle. And then I received a phone call from Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes indicating to me that they had the same information.
That's not good.
No, not good at all.
Yeah, that's never good when you get a call from 60 Minutes.
Yeah. And I knew I had done several 60 Minutes programs earlier in my career back in Washington. So I knew Leslie Stahl fairly well. And so I told her I couldn't talk to her about a case, but I could just tell her that we had been contacted with information. We had looked into it and there was no story for her to run with. She said fine and went on. Well, about 4 or 5 days later, I got another call from her and they were pursuing this same story. And I said, Leslie, why are you still looking at this? And she said, well, Ross Perot contacted us and said that the FBI wasn't properly pursuing this case and that there was something hinky going on with the Bureau. And he wanted 60 Minutes to run the story because he believed it was still true that the Bush campaign was trying to collect intelligence inside his organization. And I told Leslie, I said, I can't comment on the case. I can just simply say there's no basis for us to investigate anything that has come out of these circumstances you're discussing. She says, well, we still are going to go with the program and we would like you to come on and tell us why the Bureau isn't investigating. I told her, I said, well, I'm not going to do that. Let me talk to headquarters and let's see if there's anything we can do to get you out under this situation you're involved in. I called back to headquarters. I talked with the chain of command and I ended up talking with the Sessions. And I said, Director, you ought to go on and tell the nation, because we're right in the midst of a very sensitive political campaign, the facts that we can release and that the Bureau did look into them. And there was no basis to believe that either the Bush campaign or the Perot organization were engaged in any criminal activity against or for either case. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, well, they're going to run with the story. It's going to put us in the middle and it's going to look like we were unwilling to do our duty. He says, well, then you talk to him. So I called Leslie back and said, this is what I can do. And this is as far as we can go. And it's up to you and Don Hewitt, the executive producer, as to whether or not that would be of any interest. The next day she called me back and says, yes, I've talked to Don. He wants to go with the story. When can I come see you? Well, I said, I'm here. So she flew the next day to Dallas. We sat down in my office and I told her that we had allegations that we'd received, came from the police department. I went through the whole process as to what we could talk about and simply said, we ran out the leads and found no corroboration of any illegal activity on the part of either Perot or Bush campaigns and organizations. And the Bureau has no further ongoing investigation into that. She said, well, that's what we're going to say. I said, fine. About a week later, the story ran. And then that Sunday, I was in Detroit and I got a phone call from FBI headquarters. And they indicated that Doug Gow, who was in Detroit for the conference, wanted to talk with me. So I said, well, have him come see me. And so we met, and he said, everybody at the Bureau was very happy with the program, but we've got a call from the White House, and they're very upset. And I said, well, wait a minute, why? And he said, well, because Oberwetter has complained about the FBI was trying to entrap him by sending an undercover agent to meet with him, and that there was no basis for us to do that, and therefore we were interfering in the campaign. I said, well, everybody knows that's not true, involved as far as the investigation. They said, well, that may be, but Sessions has directed that you be interviewed by Office of Professional Responsibility here in Washington tomorrow. Well, that was Sunday, so that would be Monday morning. The people talking to me had no idea what was going on. They simply knew the director had indicated that I ought to be interviewed because there had been a complaint from the White House about the FBI engaging in activity that was detrimental to them and had put them in a position of having to disclaim any involvement, any activity allegedly directed at Perot.
Could you do me a favor?
Sure.
Could you give us a little bit of information about what that 60-minute piece covered?
Okay.
We know what you said. What did they say?
Okay, the 60 Minutes piece came out with essentially the allegations that Barnes had made and Taylor had at least partially supported, and that it had been turned over to the police, and that the FBI had been brought in, and the FBI had investigated and had said there's no violation, case closed. That's essentially what they said. Then they put Perot on, and Perot said, well, there's obviously something amiss here, something the FBI is not properly following this, something hinky over at the Bureau. And that is where it ended. And their point was Perot is not willing to accept the fact that there's no basis for these allegations and essentially to move on. And that's where it ended. I had actually gotten a call also in Detroit from the White House, an individual I knew there quite well who had been in the Justice Department and was now the cabinet secretary. And after the program, he called me and said, well, we're really happy over here because you really set Perot straight. I said, no, I didn't. I told exactly what had happened, and that was it. And if it embarrasses Perot, I'm sorry, but that's where it is. And then, of course, the reverberation came back when Oberwetter had complained to young George that the FBI was trying to entrap him, and that had come from the White House back to the Bureau, that the White House was upset and wanted to know why we had tried to entrap the campaign manager for the president in Texas into committing a violation of law. And that's what brought me back to meet with OPR in Washington.
These type of investigations are really a nightmare. They're the obligation of the FBI. There's no one else who is in a better position to investigate these type of allegations. But it is always the political hot potato because it depends on what side of the aisle you're on, whether or not the FBI is doing a good thing or a bad thing. And sometimes I guess both sides think the FBI is doing a bad thing.
Well, and that's exactly what happened here is that because of Oberwetter's reaction, the President Bush, the White House became very concerned that the FBI was trying to entrap a presidential or a campaign director of the Bush campaign. And Perot felt like the FBI was not following an allegation that there was ample predication for because the Bureau was being directed and controlled by the White House, both of which were not true, but they put us exactly in the middle. And then it fell back because our director at the time chose not to step up. It fell back to allegations that the SAC in Dallas, namely Buck Revell, had done all this as some sort of a political outlaw and had essentially drawn people into a situation where these allegations were being made, but they couldn't be corroborated, and it was strictly now a smear campaign.
Oh, boy. I have a wave of deja vu taking over.
Right. So I went back to Washington, met with OPR. I won't use the names of the people because I think they're embarrassed that they were even involved. But let's put it this way. I was quite exercised and adamant that we had done the right thing. We had cleared it the right way. Everybody up through and including the director and the deputy attorney general knew exactly what we were doing. And Buck Revell wasn't going to put up with this BS. and I left. So that's where it ended up there. So, things went along and the campaign ended. President Bush was defeated. The Clinton campaign had not been involved in this at all, and they had wisely kept their mouths shut. So when the campaign ended, I went back to headquarters and said, all right, I now want to go talk with Jim Oberwetter and Ross Perot and tell them exactly what happened, how it happened, and why we did what we did. So since the campaign was over and there had been no offense to present, they agreed, and I went and talked with Jim Oberwetter. He still was very reluctant to agree that what we had done was the right thing, although he finally ended up saying he understood. Then I talked with Ross Perot. He said, well, I just thought there might be something to it. It sounded like things they would do, and I really wanted to get to the bottom of it, and I thought the Bureau was being manipulated. So I convinced Ross that was not true. Sometime later, I actually had an opportunity after he had come back to Texas and started up his institute at Texas A&M to sit down with President Bush and went over exactly what had happened and why. And he acknowledged and sent me a nice little note that I'm glad you did what you had to do and that things worked out. So it turned out fine. But in the meantime, I was trying to get Taylor and Barnes in particular prosecuted. But the Bush had lost the election and they didn't want to do anything further to keep that ongoing. And so Barnes walked free of this, and Taylor was never called to task because the decision was made by the political apparatus that they did not want to pursue these false allegations any further. So again, the Bureau took it on the chin, was trying to do the right thing, did the right thing as far as I was concerned, and yet both parties came out with the complaints about our activities and how we had pursued this very sensitive and difficult investigation.
Were there any allegations or, any complaints that the leaking of this information had anything to do with Bush losing that presidential campaign, his reelection campaign?
No, because all of this occurred before the election actually took place. So Perot had dropped out. The campaign continued.
So this was during the primary.
Right. And this was during the time that actually had gone past the primary and Perot had dropped out and it was Clinton v. Bush, and none of this affected the Clinton campaign. So that part of it actually had dropped out of the picture. So it was a matter of clearing up in the minds of Jim Oberwetter and the Bush campaign and Ross Perot that the Bureau had acted properly on the basis of information that was presented to us in a manner that was the least intrusive to the political process that we could possibly do.
Wow. This is just so fascinating, to hear. And the Bureau has gone through, periods of time in our history, the history of the FBI, where they have been accused of being partisan and being involved in politics, but nothing, at least from my understanding, from my perspective, like it's happening today. And I don't want to, make any type of partisan comments. And the only reason I do that is because nobody will be happy.
That's true.
And this is not the type of show that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just present FBI cases. So I'm trying to find a way to ask you some questions that relate to what's going on today without either one of us, taking sides, but looking at the reality of how, as you used the word, precarious it is for the FBI and individuals. Because in your case, you were pulled on the carpet. You were told that you had done something wrong. You were being investigated by the Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR. And so I really would like to talk about that. But is it possible for us to do that without having a political conversation? What do you think?
Probably not. If you get at that level and you have the ongoing animosity of the partisan divide. In this case, it was an independent and the Republican establishment. Obviously now it's the Democrat versus Republican, but certainly there are issues here. I think that when then Director Comey had a press conference and outlined the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails, he stepped beyond the scope of anything the Bureau is authorized to do or should have done.
I totally agree with that. As a former FBI media rep and spokesperson, I know that to be absolutely true.
And unfortunately, that then drew other aspects of that activity into the political arena, including had the FBI been precluded from conducting an adequate investigation in the Clinton emails and so forth. And then, of course, that rolled over and we got into the whole issue of the FISA investigation. And I will tell you, I probably approved 50 or 60 FISA investigation requests for FISA technical coverage. And I never saw anything like the so-called Steele dossier. And if I had, we'd stopped right there. So there's something to be determined here when we get the IG report as to how that process broke down. And it in my view, it put the Bureau in a very precarious situation in investigating allegations that probably needed to be investigated, but not in putting forward information that had not been substantiated and was not originally sourced by the Bureau. So those are areas that give me concern, is that how did the Bureau get itself in the position where on one hand, the director was making statements in public that he wasn't authorized or in any way responsible to make, and how on the other hand did we go forward with a very sensitive counterintelligence FISA request with information we allegedly had not independently verified. Those are the two issues, Jerry, that give me great concern. So, I want to see what Inspector General Horowitz has to say about it. But right now, that does give me great concern. And I think that we need to get to the bottom of that so that in the future, this doesn't happen. I talked to Director Wray about 3 weeks ago, and I let him know that amongst us old retirees who had been in this ball game, we had to get to the bottom of this and find out, why was the Bureau involved in this dossier FISA matter, and how did we get manipulated in this process? Because it's obvious to me that there were people trying to manipulate the Bureau, and unfortunately, the Bureau put itself in a precarious situation by some of the actions that it took. I don't think there was any, at this point, that there was any sort of overblown conspiracy. I do think that some people made some very bad judgments and will need to be held responsible for that.
And again, when we talk about deja vu, you can really see how what happened in Dallas back in, 1992,
right,
is similar, because you have this very wild allegation and you are committed to checking that out and verifying it or dismissing it prior to it being used for any other type of investigative methods.
If this had come to us just by a walk into the door, we still would have had to at least done some preliminary inquiries, because you had a person coming in backed up by a reporter of an international news organization saying that, a major party, the Republicans, were spying on a candidate using illegal means. Well, obviously, we had to look into that, and we had to be very careful how we did it. But to simply say, well, we're not going to look at it, would have been the dereliction of our duty.
And that's the same thing with the Steele.
Absolutely. The Steele dossier needed to be examined. It needed to be corroborated or determined not to be legitimate. And then you make a determination if you use it. I think you have to do that before you go to the FISA court. And apparently that didn't occur. And I think that's the crux of the issue, is now you have the FISA court saying the Bureau and the department deceived it. And that puts us at a very precarious circumstance when the court doesn't believe the Bureau or the department in pursuing these very sensitive investigations.
All I can say, it's very disturbing and very sad. I don't know the outcome. I, of course, also wait for the IG report, but I think every agent, no matter what side of the political fence they're on, really wants the best for the FBI. We want to restore our reputation for those who question the Bureau's integrity. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, Jerry, I was in the Bureau for 30 years. I've told you some of the prior cases that became national issues on political process. Never in my 30 years did anybody ask me what party I belonged to. I didn't. Who I supported, who I had contributed to, or ever make any inference that I should take into account any sort of political objective. And I think that's the standard that we must rely on in the Bureau. And in my experience, it was. And if people inside the Bureau stepped outside that, then they need to be dealt with. But the organization as a whole has got to be put on course to proceed according to the facts and circumstances and their jurisdiction and responsibility, and not back off because it might become sensitive or become a matter of political conjecture. And I think that's what the Bureau's got to do.
Yeah, that's hard to do on an individual level when you know that you're actually putting your own reputation and possibly career, on the line.
Well, I always followed a dictate that if you're afraid of getting fired, you can't do your job. You got to proceed on the basis of what you need to do and let the chips fall where they may.
And I do. I guess I feel like I need to take some type of put on my big girl pants and take make some type of statement. And I feel comfortable in doing that. I don't know what happened, and that's what we're waiting to find out. But in my deep inner belief, I don't believe in a conspiracy. I don't believe in a deep state.
Well, I certainly hope and obviously believe that the entire organization was not wrapped up in some sort of conspiracy, even at the senior levels in headquarters. I do think some individuals made mistakes. We've already seen some of that, but we need to get that rooted out so the Bureau can go back to doing what it needs to do, irrespective of the political issues involved. There is no other entity in our government that can address these issues. Therefore, the Bureau has got to be restored in the public's mind to that organization they can depend on to go in and investigate, whether it's Watergate, Iran-Contra, whatever it might be, and come out with the facts. As old Jack Webb used to say on Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
So true. And that's one of the reasons that, as I have expressed to everyone, that I've been working so hard on this podcast and letting the FBI case reviews speak for themselves, and trying not to put in my own thoughts and opinions. But, I felt like I needed to do a little something today. I didn't want people to think that, I believe that there is a conspiracy. I believe that there's some problems and some issues. I believe that the intentions were pure. Maybe though they were handled incorrectly, that the intentions were to try to get down to, the bottom of the matter, just like you were able to do in your investigation with the Bush Perot issue so many years ago. So we're at a time where I like to make sure that my guests have had the opportunity to say everything they want about this particular case or issue that we're talking about. So just like before, I'm going to give you the last word.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. The investigation of a sitting president, his party, or those in opposition to him is absolutely the most sensitive thing the FBI can do. However, it is a responsibility of the bureaus to do so in a straightforward fashion and to let the chips fall where they may. And we saw that with President Nixon and Watergate. He had been very supportive of the bureau, but it turned out he had engaged in illegal activities and it had to be dealt with. And I think that the other cases we've cited show that to be the case. And I feel like in my discussions with Director Wray that he's got the right idea of going forward and rebuilding the public trust. And the way you do that is by doing the right thing on a continuing regular basis. The Bureau has got to be straightforward, objective, and bring the facts out and let the facts speak for themselves and never get involved in any sort of political processing of the facts and circumstances as we move forward.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Buck Revell, numerous newspaper articles about this case, links to Buck's book, A G-Man's Journal, a legendary career inside the FBI from the Kennedy assassination to the Oklahoma City bombing. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.